Let's start with prayer. Holy Heavenly Father, we're so incredibly blessed for all that you've given us and for the opportunity that we have this morning to study from your word. Pray that we'll be attentive, that we'll look to past of your people, of your kings, and we can better learn how to live in our day today in order to serve and please you throughout our lives. Be with Brayden as he presents the lesson, that he'll remember what he has prepared, that we will participate well. Above all, you are pleased. Through your son we pray. Amen.
Our memory verse, 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. I was looking this week, I think I wrote the wrong version up there. I think that's the New King James. So the wording's a little different in the ESV. So it's different in Zach's class. That's why it's my bad. As we come into this week, we picked up our reading in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Is there anything from last week, 1 Samuel 18 through 2 Samuel 1, that we didn't talk about in class that you want to touch on before we move into this week's reading? Anybody like to remind us where we're at in our readings, what events are happening there at the end of 1 Samuel as we transition into 2 Samuel?
Yeah, Saul and Jonathan.
Saul and Jonathan, other sons are killed in battle. And how does David respond here in 2 Samuel 1?
He has this great lament. You know, he shows a great deal of love for Jonathan and respect for Saul. Which he always has shown a lot of respect for Saul, despite Saul's disrespect for him.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of lessons of leadership in these books. David's a good example of following leadership, even when the leadership's not so good. It's definitely I try to put myself in the shoes of David, and it's hard to imagine having this type of attitude towards somebody who was so cruel. But it just, I don't know, what do you take away from that? How does he help you?
Doesn't really matter how our leaders treat us, what we think of them. They deserve respect that are placed over us by God. And we need to follow them as best as we can.
It's good. There's a lot of stories like this in the Old Testament where you see Jesus teaching a lesson where we can think back on this Old Testament story and see it played out in someone's life. You know, in David's case, that's see an example of someone that was willing to endure difficulty, and then, at least in this case, was treating others the way you would want to be treated. He was going to be king, and to regard the king as God's anointed would be pretty significant.
Yeah. As you said that, I think about the concept of waiting on the Lord. That's something that was brought up in a conversation. Can't even remember the context of it. Something we talked about this week, though. Waiting on the Lord. David's a good example of that. He is the rightful God anointed king, but he doesn't take that kingship out of his time. He waits on the Lord to provide the timing of all of that to work out for the best. David doesn't take Saul's life at the opportunities he has. He waits for just for God to take control and to make it happen. We're actually going to see that in some of David's prayers this week too. David doesn't presume that the promises of God, that he's earned them somehow, that there's something that he should count on because he's been so good or anything like that, but rather he he relies on the grace of God to provide the things that God's promised. Just an interesting attitude that David exhibits, I think, throughout his interactions with Saul, but even as we get to some of the more direct promises of God in 2 Samuel. As we talked in 1 Samuel, we talked about some themes of the book, themes of leadership, sovereignty of God, consequences of sin. Is there anything new that you've noticed in 2 Samuel in this week's reading? Any thematic things that you've noticed?
Consequences.
Just in general, I mean, anything out, even outside of those. Would be in regards to the consequences of sin.
Well, I was also thinking about how these transitions really, whether you think about the transition of Israel out of Egypt, or the transition of Israel into the promised land, or the transition between Saul to David. All of these are examples where God has made a promise, God's going to fulfill this promise, but it doesn't mean that it's just overnight and everything is just simple and easy. There's a lot of struggle and difficulty involved with every one of these promises being fulfilled, and the transition that it's not, again, not overnight, it's months or sometimes years of labor and difficulty and conflict before that promise is fully realized.
What else?
I think vision.
Hmm.
You see the division between Israel and Judah began.
What do you think drives that division?
Well, rather than faithful to God, there were those that were they followed Saul rather than following God, and that pretty much led to division. Of course, there were those that were loyal to David, and those loyal to Saul, instead of being united and loyal to God.
See this reference to the house of Saul versus the house of David. So there were camps, right, and tribes that were associated with those camps that were clearly divided. So just to Richard's point, it was wrong.
Yeah. See some of that creep in today, Ethan. Even we think about right versus wrong. It's a lot of times even if we choose the right side, sometimes it becomes more about supporting the figurehead leading the right side than it is just being on the right side. And that seems to be kind of the case here. David was the right king, was the appropriate choice, but it is interesting that the verbiage is it's the house of Saul versus the house of David. It's not God's side versus not God's side. It is interesting that that's how that's pointed out.
It's also interesting context that this happened. So where we ended, for Samuel, Philistines just overran the Israelite army. And now we see your Ishbosheth essentially sets up his capital in Mahanaim, which is on the east side of Jordan. So it seems like the Philistines have more or less taken over, the west side of the Jordan, with the exception of maybe kind of the southern tribe of Judah and that area. And in the midst of this, the house of David and Saul are fighting each other rather than worrying about the external threat.
Sure. Yeah. And loss of focus on their mission here in the land. What do you think would have been different? This is purely speculation. Guess we can't know. What do you think the difference would have been had Samuel been around at this point in time? Kind of interesting, at least to me, that we get the king and Samuel's work is kind of complete.
I think he would have thrown his lot with David. I think he would have, obviously he anointed David.
Yeah.
I think, maybe it would have, maybe it would have averted some additional bloodshed. Hard to say if the people would have followed Samuel. But I think, for sure he would have come down heavy on the side of David.
Yeah.
We see this when Saul was appointed. Remember, there was a group of people who rebelled and refused to follow Saul and were grumbling and complaining and didn't join him until he's appointed in chapter 10. Not until chapter 11 do they side with him based upon his own feats, even though Samuel was pushing Saul forward as God told him to do so. So maybe it would have been less contentious, but I think there would have been still some potential issues.
It almost seems to me a little bit that Samuel died at the completion of his work, and his work was helping Israel through the transition of this. Now the word's going to leave me, but where they're following God as their leader in the period as a judges to the monarchy. He helped them through that transition, and his work was complete. And we just read, he dies. It's kind of it. He dies. He's out of the picture. To me, it's almost like these transitions that become so hard, and especially when the kingdom divides, and then in the northern kingdom where it's men rising up and killing the king and taking power, those hard transitions of power are kind of the consequence of Israel's choice. They wanted a kingship. It's kind of the ugly side of the kingship. Some interesting things there. As we walk through the reading this week, chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we start with David being anointed king over specifically his tribe of Judah. What stands out to you as you start here and progress through the story? He starts small before he's becomes anointed over all of Israel. Is there anything that stood out to you?
To me, it was the number of times that he inquired of the Lord.
I agree.
Repeated inquired of the Lord, pretty much at every step, every major step.
But you see that later in his life though, right? That tapers off.
Tapers
And
off.
so in this early period, like that connection to the Lord and being guided by the Lord, it's pretty amazing. The number of frequency.
There's so much, it seems to me that he had a lot of the physical means necessary to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish without having to inquire of the Lord. And from a purely fleshly standpoint, I say that obviously, but it's just his reliance on God. It's God who's allowed him to come to this point. It's God who's anointed him king. And he continues to just go back. Is this the right thing? Should we do this at this point? Is it right to go against the Philistines here? Should we do this here? I mean, it is really significant that he does that.
I think though I'm sorry. I don't know that he was that solid though, right? So he's out in the wilderness. He's still in Ziklag when this is all happening. And he's kind of taken a little bit of will his brethren welcome him back into that role? And I don't know that it's, in his mind, it's that necessarily that guaranteed. His parents are in Moab, no longer, had a household there in Bethlehem. He's been running around the countryside. So I think it's a bit of hey, I'm going to go back and set up shop. Is this really the right thing to do?
I was just gonna say, I thought it interesting. In verse 1, chapter 2, David consults God, God responds to him. The very first thing in verse 2, David's 2 wives. So it's like they don't learn from the past. And as you read deeper into David's life, he has multiple wives and concubines, and there's consequences for all that. He has 17 sons and one that died. Don't know how many daughters, but by multiple wives. Did he consult God before he dove off into all that?
What do you think?
I don't think he did.
So it was political expediency, like the wife that was is it the
Yeah.
daughter of, Absalom winds up going back there for, the, Saul's exile, and he goes back where that, Esher, yeah, Talmai, or
Be honest, some of the names of those towns I read over and I think, don't know how to say that, it's so I can picture. Geisher, is that what you said, Matthew?
Yeah, I just say something.
All right, sounds good to me, that's what we're going with. What else as we move maybe even past chapter 2, they enter the Civil War period, Matthew?
So even in chapter 3, we see David is very reluctant to punish people who have done wrong, especially his family. So we've got Joab, who murders Abner, and David, says, "Oh, this wasn't," makes a big deal about, lamenting Abner's death. And then he basically asks God to punish Joab, doesn't do anything himself, which leads to more problems down the line. Joab is gonna do the same thing again later. And this has been a theme in Samuel, like we saw Eli, he rebuked his sons, but he didn't punish them, even though they were doing wrong. He was their boss. He should have, said, y'all can't be priests anymore unless you get your act together.
Sure.
Samuel, his sons don't turn out, and so with Eli, we see the consequences of that. Marcus, they were taken over by the Philistines. His sons die. With Samuel has exactly the same problem. He makes his sons judges. Sure, he sends them down to Beersheba as far away as he can send them, basically, but he doesn't fix their behavior. He doesn't really punish them. And then that's part of the reason why the people ask for a king. And now with David, we'll see this with Joab, and we'll see it with his sons. He doesn't punish them, even though, that's his job. He is now king, or he's their father for his sons. But there's some unwillingness to be harsh with his family, and that leads to problems.
The story of Joab with Abner is interesting. If you think about why Joab kills Abner, what do you think was the motivation behind him doing that? There's an easy answer, and then you kind of dig into it a little more, but what do you think?
Well, it's the answer he gave David, but there's also the answer like, hey, if we join up, and we become all one nation, who's gonna be the commander of the army?
There's a little selfish intention there.
Same thing that happened with Amasa later. I mean, Joab killed Abner, Amasa, and David's son, and to Matthew's point, he never was punished for it until Saul.
There's certainly some lesson there as we read through the end of chapter 3. I mean, David's reaction to almost all of this as he washes his hands and distances himself. Like, probably shouldn't have done that, but I had nothing to do with it. Maybe a lesson in just distancing ourselves isn't enough. What else? I mean, we see David mourning for Abner after the fact, and we progress forward. What else stands out to you?
Just going back to that same
Sure.
chapter, really strange request that David made of Abner when Abner came to have a covenant with David. By the way, my wife, Michael, Michelle, Michael, Saul's daughter that was given away to his friend. I want her back.
Yeah.
Just this bizarre, this has been years now, and he's not forgotten it, He wants to take care of that.
Again,
Not showing every judgment.
it requires a little bit of I guess, imagination and guessing there, but what do you think was significant about him asking for Michael?
She was Saul's daughter.
Solidify the kingdom, even though she was highly critical of him. Or
Seems to be maybe some fleshly wisdom, so to speak, there, thinking that's his end, that gives him the rightful place as a true heir to the throne, as a now a relative of Saul, maybe. A little commentary I was reading on that suggests that David never put Michael away. She was taken from him. And so he still had a right to her as his wife. And maybe he really wanted her as his wife, you know, because if we think back to First Samuel, when she's given, it talks about them loving each other. And so maybe there is some pure intention there of just now Saul's gone and he's kind of out of the way. He's the one who separated them, and it wasn't their desire to be separated. And maybe this is his test of Abner, to see if Abner will, you know, really cater to him. I don't know. Just some interesting thoughts there.
then you have the husband who goes along.
Yeah.
And she's being handed over and he's being from her.
Sad.
It's sad, it's so sad.
Yeah.
There in the end of chapter 3, where David says, even though I'm anointed king, these two sons are too strong for me to control. He didn't have any second thoughts when he slew Goliath, but now he's king, he could easily do whatever he wanted. But he turns it over to God.
It's the progression. We talked about David inquiring of the Lord. Stu, you mentioned that maybe he's a little, it happens less frequency, or with less frequency as he goes forward. It's almost the more control, the more power he has in the flesh, the more fear we see in him. You go back to, you know, Shepherd David, who's killing wild animals with his bare hands. He goes to fight Goliath. He doesn't take armor, he takes a sling. He's now in this position where people are rising up and he's starting to see them as threats to him. And he's fearful. And we get further and further down into the story, and there's just more opportunity for stuff like that. I don't know that it says that David wasn't faithful or right. He's a friend of God, right? He's some interesting character flaws even in a good man. What else as we move on? What about chapter 4? We get in chapter 4 with Ishbosheth being murdered. Anything stand out to you there?
It's interesting, David's willing to punish the people who did that. Just like he punished the Amalekite, he planned to kill Saul. It's just his own family that he's not gonna to do that, to
Yeah.
kill them.
Yeah. We get into chapter 5. David's now appointed king over all Israel. We see some interesting stories here. Anything stand out to you in chapter 5?
Seems like he gets to work pretty quick. Moves on from this internal strife to now doing the job he was appointed to do, which is to push out the original inhabitants of land that were left out.
So we finally take Jerusalem. Jerusalem's finally taken, and it's done now. Stays with Israel for a long time here. Goes to war with the Philistines. How did David respond? So they have victory. We see in chapter 5, verse 20 and 21. How does David respond to this victory? See him, we were talking before, he sees, into chapter 3, some sons that are, too harsh for him, or I think your version said too hard to control. And some fear creeping in, but he goes, he battles the Philistines, and in verse 20, he says, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me, like a breakthrough of water. He's crediting the victory to the Lord. The Philistines leave their idols behind, and David and his men take them. Why do you think David and his men take them?
Well, in First Chronicles 14, you have the same story in verse 12, it says they burned him.
So it seems like they got their mission straight here. We're driving out the Philistines, we're doing away with their gods, we're cleaning up here. It seems to me what's going on. So we get to chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant's talked about again. This is a really interesting story to me, but so what stands out to you in chapter 6?
I see the significance of how David took Jerusalem, became called the city of David, Zion. I mean, those names are all spoken of there in chapter 5, and then here in chapter 6, the ark is brought into Jerusalem. And how meaningful that would be for really all of history that would follow, and how all the imagery we see in Hebrews with the sacrifices of the temple and all of those things, and Jesus being that ultimate sacrifice. Really, all the foundation for us to understand how significant that is right here in seeing David overtaking Jerusalem and the ark being brought into it.
How important did David show that the Ark of the Covenant being in Jerusalem was to him? Chapter 6, verse 1. Yeah, there's all the choice men of war, 30,000 people to go bring this ark. Really significant. Why'd they get it wrong?
They didn't consult what God told them to.
So we have, I mean, it's so important that we're gonna take 30,000 people with us to go get this ark, to bring it to Jerusalem, and we're not gonna transport it the right way. It's just. We could talk about intention. Did he know? Should he have known? It's been away for so long that, maybe there's some disconnect in understanding. I don't know. The point is they handle it the wrong way. Even though it was so important, and they weren't judged for their intentions, they were judged for their actions. We have the story of Uzzah here, and with Uzzah, we see some pure intentions of wanting to protect and preserve the ark, keep it from falling and breaking maybe, or being damaged, and he's struck dead. Why is Uzzah struck dead?
Well, for disobedience, I don't know if Abinadab was of the tribe of Levi or not. I don't know if any of them were, but the Levites surely knew how it was to be transported. If David didn't know, they did.
So, and I think there's a couple of issues here. One, none of them were transporting it right. As it gets the focus of God's wrath, and touch it, grab hold of it, inappropriate. But I do think it's interesting what David's reaction is. He gets angry. It says angry because the Lord is broken out against him. Be angry with God, angry at himself, be angry at the situation. And then it says he's afraid in verse 9. He's afraid of the Lord. How am I gonna get this? He clearly recognizes it's important to have the ark with him, but he did it wrong. And somebody paid the price for that.
One thing stands out here back in the chapter, in the context of chapter 5, we have this, what's described as the Lord breaks out against them, so there was an outbreak. That's exactly the same language about how God defeated the Philistines. So it's interesting here, there's this tie between Uzzah doing, mishandling the ark and the Philistines, where it describes God as breaking out against both of them. And then to make the point really clear, it also talks about they named the place based on that event. You've got Baal Perazim and then Perez Uzzah.
Yeah.
He does though, he does all these things incredibly simply. But once that is brought to his attention through the death of Uzzah and all those things that happens, he stops. He's angry. But then it's a 3-month cool off period before he turns around, does what he's supposed to do, and gives God the respect. And this word, the law that was set down, the respect it deserves in order to do what God wanted to do.
Look at Hebrews 12 with me, if you would. Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12, verse 28. The writer says, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably, with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Think about these verses in relationship to this story, and there's things that are happening that are unacceptable. It seems to me that they understand the importance of the ark being in Jerusalem. They want it there, they need it there. It seems to be the right thing for them to be doing. As we see, they get it to Jerusalem, and that's going to be very historically significant moving forward. But in their operation, their means of carrying this out, they don't behave appropriately or acceptably based on the proper respect for God and his law and his rule. And it's interesting that when you take that to even the New Testament, the characteristics of God that we see here are reaffirmed there. Our God is a consuming fire. He expects us to behave acceptably with reverence and godly fear, and to carry out our work in a way that shows respect for him and his word and who he is. And the consequences of not doing so are severe. So we look at Uzzah, and it's kind of one of those things that I think about a lot anyway, from the standpoint of it almost seems unfair. Why Uzzah? Why was Uzzah the one that's pinpointed with the punishment? Well, he's the one that actually reached out and touched the ark. That was very clearly defined as a consequence of doing that action. God was faithful. Uzzah didn't have the proper reverence for the ark, for his role in regards to the ark. He reaches out and touches it, and God is faithful. God's a consuming fire. God struck him for that. David responds, he's fearful, whether his initial anger is at Uzzah for being careless, maybe it's at himself for implementing this the wrong way, maybe it's towards God because he doesn't understand God's justice. He's angry. He becomes fearful. They leave the ark behind, but it's not very long later that David responds appropriately. They get the ark, and their response is to do what?
Transport it correctly.
Transport it correctly. But what's David doing?
Offering sacrifices.
Sum that up to worship. He's offering sacrifices. He's dancing before the Lord. There's this whole display that's happening that is I think it's one of the more people talk about what would you like to go back and see, and this is one of those things. I would love to see this story play out just from the standpoint of think about all the emotion that goes into this worship that he's offering God at this point. They've had this 3-month time period, it seems, where there was anger, there was fear, there's a lot of emotion, and they seem to learn their lesson and they respond appropriately, and that's to honor God. They honor God appropriately. As you think about this scene of worship, you talked about Michael being critical. Walk us through what happens here. I think this is just so interesting.
Celebration. In her eyes, David looks like a fool. She says, from her window, she saw David dancing before the Lord, and she was filled with contempt. And so when David returned, Michael, I was dancing before the Lord. Oh, she said it because how distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any other vulgar person might do.
One through about short earpods. It's cloak, it might have been too short.
Yeah.
How does David respond to the criticism?
He says to her, God chose me over your father, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. He doesn't take it well. There's no attempt to understand where she's coming from, or talk to her. He's just like, you think this is bad? Just wait and see what comes next.
Seems to be several ways that David points us to Jesus in the sense that from boyhood, the whole story with Goliath, that he is a young man, is able to go against this giant. Him coming from the youngest son, and now here he's described by his own wife as someone who is shameless and so forth. Well, Jesus was not the king that Israel was looking for either. He was shameful in the eyes of Israel, which is really, in a sense, his bride. It was the promised people of God, and yet they were despising him because he wasn't what they thought the Messiah, or the King of Israel, should be. So maybe this is a little glimpse of that here. I don't know, but Michael certainly doesn't show very much regard for David based on what's his leaping before the ark.
David's response sounds pretty good to me, in that he's pointing out, he's saying, I'm not worried about what these people think about me, I'm worried about what God thinks about me. It's God that he's trying to honor, and that's what he's worried about here. And I would argue that, David seems to be vindicated here, and right after that, it says, Michael had no children to the day of her death, which, in this context, children are very much viewed as a gift of the Lord, as the Lord fulfilling one of those promises he made to Abraham. So that kind of sounds like divine vindication for David. I'm going to go back a little bit to earlier in the chapter and point out it's really interesting where David leaves the ark for those 3 months. It's the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. So the fact that he's a Gittite means he's from Gath. He's a Philistine. So it's very interesting here. Again, there are a lot of instances here where the righteousness of a non-Israelite is compared against the failures of the Israelites. Just Obed-Edom apparently respects it, doesn't touch it when he shouldn't, and God blesses his household. Big contrast where we saw God broke out against Uzzah. The last chapter, God broke out against the Philistines. You go all the way back to 1 Samuel. When the Philistines took the ark and didn't treat it with respect, things did not go well for them. But now this Philistine seems to respect God and is blessed for that, in contrast with when the Israelites don't.
Sure.
So I read verse 23 a little bit differently, as in, it's not so much that, Michael's womb was closed, like that's the use of other places where the womb was closed with God, for Her and Sarah. I looked at it as their relationship was destroyed. And, you know, there's no relationship, their marriage is shot, and so they don't have that relationship. So she lived alone and aloof. After that is kind of the way I take that, and maybe that's not incorrect, but that's what.
Doing some reading on Michael's comments. Again, it's one of those things that we have what we have and read somebody else's speculation on it. We can kind of conclude for ourselves what to make of it. The suggestion was made, though, that Michael's comments to David weren't so much that his applaud was too short, or maybe he was doing something inappropriate. It was more that he was making himself as a common man with the common people. And Michael, as the daughter of a king, now married to the king, sees this as inappropriate, as behavior that's not befitting of a king. Not that he exposed himself inappropriately, but that the actions weren't that as to show the class distinction between the king and the common people. And again, I don't know what to do with that, other than, you know, maybe the words she uses are strong words to indicate her feelings about that just being thoroughly inappropriate for the king to be intermingling with these common folk. And so whether that's right or not, when I get to David's response, what I appreciate about David's response is he does point back to God, and I kind of relate to what this writer was suggesting might be the case here with Michael's comment. When I think about it from that perspective, and I read David's response, it's more of a, you need to check yourself. Like, your father's not the king. Like, you don't get to behave in this high mighty way. I'm the God appointed king. You know, that's what God appointed for me. And what I'm doing isn't out there acting like a king. That's not the point. I'm worshiping God, and my worship is before God. And so long as that's the case, I'll be even more undignified than what you saw me out there be, because my actions are for God.
If you look at First Chronicles 15, I think you have a little bit more evidence for what you're talking about here, because it says, in addition to the ephod, he also wore this long linen robe, right? So it's not like he's out there completely unclothed. Maybe in the process he did become unclothed, to Tim's point,
Sure.
But there's no indication anywhere that that is what happened, aside from Michael's comment, which is a little ambiguous.
Sure. Yeah. I like this story. To me, this is a story that I go to when I'm thinking about even my attitude in worship today. I know what David was doing. He's offering sacrifices, he's dancing, he's offering music, all of this stuff he's doing for the Lord. In the context of what is and is not appropriate Old Testament worship, or what translates to the New Testament worship, isn't the point of going here, but the attitude behind his actions is what I think about. I see a man who's focused on God, giving God the glory. He's had this emotional journey here in these few verses, in these few months, where he goes from anger to fear to praise. And I just think there might be some lessons for us about how we worship. Our worship in the auditorium or out on our own on the in the week is not for other people. I think about comments are made, well, Stu, I liked your comment last night at the depot. He seems, well, you should say it, because, I'm not gonna get it right, but he was talking about why he sings tenor.
Oh. Yeah, those people like me to sing 10 or 15 miles away.
But sometimes we have Christians, brethren who make comments like that, and it's not just, in jest, it's not just a joke, they mean like, I don't wanna sing because I care about what other people think. Or I don't wanna behave this way in worship because I care about what other people see and think of me. And when I look at a story like this, David's actions, he didn't care what other people thought. He didn't care what other people concluded about his behavior, because his behavior was for God. And I think there's some lessons there for us, maybe. Any other comments about this text?
I just think the one verse that really stands out is from that First Chronicles rendition that says, verse 13 of chapter 15, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord talking to the Levites, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the rule. They had it, they just didn't follow it.
Yeah. Yeah. We're gonna run out of time yet again. So as we move on, we have our memory verse in the next chapter here, God's making the promises to David. David responds. Some interesting response by David, thanking God. David further prevails in further conquest. I think chapter 9 is one that stood out to me. Go ahead,
Let's
Stu.
go back to chapter 7, chapter 8. I think for me, this is like a huge point in David's reign, and also interesting comment on his relationship. And this is where he says, this is Jesus, right? He is talking about Jesus, he's talking about his kingdom, and he's casting this in light of, I never asked you to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house that's never ever been. And then when David finally gets that, verse 18, it says, he went in and sat before the Lord. And then he has this discussion with them. I just think that's really interesting about his relationship with God, and how he went to talk to God, sat before the Lord, and he talked to God, and about this blessing that was going to come upon him. It's just an amazing section of scripture.
That's one that some good advice there for us today too. We get that relationship with God that David had. We're able to have that. We're able to go sit with God and talk to God and hear from God. And I think we're really blessed to live in the time that we live in, where we all individually are able to do that. We don't have to go through a priest or a preacher or an elder or the Pope or any of these religious bodies that put barriers between us and God. We get to have the type of relationship with God that David had, that we can go sit at the feet of God, we can hear from God, we can talk to him. Certainly with the right attitudes, as we've talked about in Hebrews 12. Obviously, we're not going to get through any more of the text this morning. Is there anything else that you want to say about this week's reading?
I think it's interesting that the religious world as a whole does not have the kind of respect for our worship to God that he desires. And we see that here. We see that with Nadab and Abihu. We see that the verse you pointed out in Hebrews chapter 12. But as a general rule, the religious world does not see it that way.
Yeah, it is interesting. We have so many cases of them having the rule pointed out, Stu, in 1 Chronicles 15. They have the rule, they chose not to follow it. We have a religious world today that has the rule, that just a general disregard for it. Next week, reading 2 Samuel 16 through the end of 2 Samuel, the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings. Stu will be teaching next week. I'll be out of town, but I think he's going to have some interesting material for you. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.